My name is Nicole Rosen, and I am very excited to be presenting this webinar titled Exploring the Role of Siblings in Autism. So our agenda for today's talk, first I'll focus on the importance of siblings, and I'll particularly do this through the lens of autism. Next, I'll briefly review the literature on the impact of siblings on development across the lifespan in autism. And then finally, for the majority of this talk, I'll present findings from a new study focusing on the perspectives of the non-affected siblings of autistic individuals and what we've learned from that study. So we'll zoom out to start talking about the importance of sibling relationships. We know that sibling relationships are one of the most transformative and meaningful relationships that an individual might have. And this is particularly relevant because siblings have a lifetime duration in terms of their relationship. And this is important for autistic individuals because we know that difficulties in autism tend to persist across the lifespan for most individuals. And that lifetime duration of the sibling relationship really allows for continued support through those life stages and that continued life partner to help. We also know that siblings occupy many roles within the sibling relationship. And some of those include kind of the play partner, conversation partner, they could be the friend, the support system, a teacher, lots of other roles. And we also know that these roles change over time. And something that I'll be focusing on in this talk is there's this common change in adulthood when some siblings decide to take on that role of caregiver for their autistic sibling. So looking specifically in autism, we know that individuals with autism can experience significant gains when siblings are included in intervention or in different types of support services. And we see gains in the areas of social engagement, joint attention, and lots of others. And what's great about these gains is we see some of these competencies can generalize to really promote these continued improvements in overall social communication. There's some improvements noted in peer relationships, overall social emotional understanding. All of that seems to be improved by the inclusion of siblings in intervention work. It's also thought that siblings engage with autistic individuals in a way that actually mirrors typically developing peers and that peer interaction. And this is helpful because we know that a lot of autistic individuals have difficulty developing close, meaningful friendships with peers. And this is kind of implying that siblings can potentially supplement that role and really help to assist autistic individuals in gaining those skills when other areas of those peer relationships are more difficult. Existing research in autism has found that having siblings has been associated with many important positive outcomes. And I think this is something that I am particularly passionate about because I think there's such a focus on in the literature on the negatives or kind of things that are more challenging. So the difficulties with the sibling relationships, adjustment problems, greater mental health struggles, all of these things. But what we also know is that siblings are incredibly important for the development of autistic individuals, and also that siblings themselves can benefit from having an autistic sibling. So what we do know in terms of the positive frame of this is having siblings in autism has been shown to impact adaptive functioning over time. So seeing better adaptive functioning, better ability to do those independent skills, things that help you in your everyday life, stronger social and nonverbal communication skills, and better theory of mind abilities. And this is all to say that the sibling relationship is bidirectional. So both the sibling and the autistic individual are affected in different ways. And we really need research to better understand how to support both groups, both sides of this. And this brings us to the bulk of what I'll be talking about in this presentation, the NextGen Sips project funded by the Autism Science Foundation. And the big kind of framework for this study is we often hear the term unaffected sibling to describe that sibling without autism. But when we really think about what unaffected means, it's a bit of a misnomer because there's no such thing as an unaffected sibling in autism. every sibling who has an individual with autism in the family, that sibling is significantly influenced and affected by having an autistic sibling in the family. It might be different for different families, but there is an effect. We know that that effect is present in childhood as the siblings kind of grow up together. During adulthood, as some of them, the non-autistic siblings, think about having children of their own and think about how potentially growing up with autism and having autism in the family might impact their decision to have children of their own. And also during later adulthood, as the non-autistic siblings might be thinking about taking on a caregiving role for their autistic sibling. And just some numbers and prevalence and recurrence rates to get us started. And keep in mind that these numbers get updated as we gain more information from generous research participants like yourselves. And autism prevalence and recurrence really plays an important role in this conversation that we will begin having about that next generation and how we can help siblings. We know that around 1.5 to 2.7% of children are diagnosed with autism. And among siblings of autistic individuals, we know that around 6 to 20% of these siblings also have ASD themselves. And then thinking about the next generation, 3 to 5% of individuals with an autistic aunt or uncle also have autism themselves, and that's that next generation. So the aims of this study were to first engage typically developing adult siblings in focus groups to discuss their experiences having an autistic sibling, their thoughts and feelings about how having an autistic sibling has impacted their expectations for the future, particularly related to decisions about parenthood, and also their attitudes towards research and really their general willingness to participate in future research. We are wrapping up this multi-site study at UCLA and Emory University, where we have been conducting focus groups and individual interviews with a target sample of 50 to 100 typically developing siblings of autistic individuals. And we've also been including, when interested, their spouses or partners. And we can come back to this later if interested, but just some general demographic differences. And I want to note that the non-autistic siblings are 69% female, while the autistic siblings are about 77% male. Just something to know. Okay, now getting into the key takeaways grouped into categories, and I'll preface everything that I say by making it clear that these findings are representative of the thoughts and feelings of the sample included in the study of the participants who took the time to do these focus groups and individual interviews, and that other siblings might feel differently, and different situations and different family dynamics might kind of bring about different feelings and different responses to these questions. First, we'll explore sibling relationships, and we're looking both in the past, so thinking about childhood, and current, thinking about adulthood. We know that sibling contact in the form of, this can be face-to-face communication, instant messaging, video chats, texts, whatever form of communication, tends to decrease over time from childhood through adulthood as parents kind of continue to maintain the primary caregiving role for the autistic individual. But what we will likely see, and a lot of people commented on this, is that this pattern will change as parents become older and start to need more assistance in caring for the autistic individual and need that assistance from the siblings. Relatedly, we saw 3 kind of common barriers emerge related to spending time with the autistic siblings. And the big ones were physical distance, social barriers, and we kind of captured this to mean communication challenges interacting, and safety and behavioral concerns. And we'll dive into each of these. So unsurprisingly, we saw physical distance as the most highly endorsed barrier to spending time with the autistic sibling. We know that as siblings grow up, they move away from their autistic siblings for jobs, family, other reasons, and that makes it difficult to maintain contact with their autistic siblings. And throughout this presentation, I thought it would be really helpful just to get the language directly from the siblings who participated in the study. So we'll go through some quotes that really embody what the main takeaway messages were. So first, for physical distance, some participants said, he's currently living in a group home in a different state. Because I am very busy with both my kids, I don't have as much involvement in his day-to-day as I would like. And this sentiment was really echoed throughout, with the physical distance regretting kind of being that far away and wishing that the opportunities to connect were just much easier, and that distance was really the impeding factor. We also saw things like, because we were not having the casual interactions on a daily or weekly basis, we didn't end up having more meaningful interactions. Distance has hurt us. And this was true for a lot of people, where the relationship, while they used to be really close during childhood and they interacted all the time and they felt really emotionally close, as the physical distance increased, the kind of emotional connection decreased over time. While I would love to see him more, it is just so hard now. We live in different parts of the state and we both have our own things going on. This was also something echoed. Physical distance also kind of related to you're away for a reason, and a lot of them were away for a job, for raising their own family, and life happens and things were challenging, and there's a lot of responsibilities that come with it. So that additional burden of traveling the physical distance feels pretty significant. Second was social barriers, and that was referring to difficulties engaging with the autistic sibling due to communication challenges. We also saw things like attentional difficulties and other challenges that were captured within the social barriers category. And things that participants said, he definitely acknowledges the fact that I'm there, and he shows the interest in that, but it's just a very kind of passive relationship. We're not able to carry on a conversation or anything like that. So basically, obviously noticing each other and acknowledging each other is pretty much the extent of it. And this was something echoed by a big portion of our sample. We had a nice representation of siblings whose autistic siblings do not have spoken language, and a good half who do. And so this mix was representative of, in this next quote, something that we see first for those who did not have spoken language, and then this next one primarily for those who do have spoken language and just having difficulty connecting. So he may not directly express that he likes having people around or having a family gathering, but when he misses something because he has work or another obligation, he's upset. He wants to be part of it, but doesn't necessarily express it. And that sentiment of regret and wishing that you got the invite was something that, after a lot of siblings heard others say that, it was this kind of general consensus that, yeah, I wish that I had reached out more. And that's something that I'm going to try to work on, because it's really the effort that I put in that means so much to my sibling. And third was safety and behavioral concerns. So this was related to situations where the autistic sibling was aggressive with themselves or others, engaged in eloping behaviors, and other safety or behavioral concerns. Participants said things like, he can't leave the group home because he elopes, and that is dangerous. So we are pretty limited. Hopefully that gets better with time. I never know when something is going to trigger him, so it is safer to just visit him at my parents' home where everything is expected and he is comfortable. And this was something that I think also contributed to the difficulty connecting when we have this kind of safe place where technically the physical distance could be alleviated in some ways by maybe driving to a mutually close destination, something like that. But oftentimes it was where the autistic sibling was most comfortable, that was kind of the goal for the meeting place, just to really make sure that the interaction could be as positive and as comfortable for the autistic sibling as possible. Also, we're at that point where we've tried so many things. It makes me sad. And of course, we still love him and he's, brilliant in his own way, but it's very hard for our family. He's just challenging behaviorally. Lots of sentiment of when things are really tough, they're very tough and they have a big effect not only on the autistic person, but on the family. And it's kind of this trickle down effect where everybody feels it and everybody's impacted by it, but maybe that doesn't get talked about as much. Now moving into the earliest memories of autism. And this question was framed as, when did you first notice something was a little different about your sibling? When did you first notice maybe your sibling had autism? What were those early memories like? And responses for the earliest memories of autism primarily fit into 5 categories that we will dive deeper into. First, professionals or providers in the home. So noting that there are constantly people in the home who the sibling does not know, helping the autistic sibling. So we heard things like, I was watching Cinderella and my brother had a staff member over playing with him. And I was just sitting there watching TV. And I remember thinking, oh, some things are just different. There was always some appointment that we were bringing him to or some person who was coming to our house. It was constant. And this is something as we kind of continue the conversation about the amount of services that the autistic siblings had for some of these people in the study, the conversation about would you have preferred to be included in those interventions? Would it have been helpful for you to not feel potentially left out or confused, for you to be involved in interventions and learn how to do the skills that the interventionists were doing? And it was pretty much a resounding yes, I wish I was included. I don't necessarily need to take on the parenting duties, but it would have been helpful to really understand, especially in the early days, what was going on with my sibling and how I could help and how I could connect. When I asked, my mom would tell me that sibling had a special friend coming over again. And I remember feeling somewhat jealous because I wanted that attention. And this is something that we'll talk about in a little bit with this kind of desire for transparency that a lot of siblings felt like they did not get. And especially as these siblings got older, a lot of them mentioned that they didn't really have a grasp of what was really going on with the autistic sibling, what autism was, and it felt like it was kind of this hidden secret. Repetitive behaviors were another grouping of kind of signs that related to the earliest memories of autism. So we heard things like he was just pressing the button on the TV remote, mute and unmute, over and over and over again. And this was followed by a description of how in the moment it felt really frustrating and really annoying. And it was something that she in the moment could not handle and would get really angry about. But then once she had this understanding of your brother has autism, that kind of often relates to these repetitive behaviors. He's not doing this to kind of annoy you. This is a behavior that he uses to cope, or whatever the kind of primary purpose of that behavior is. And once that understanding was there, there was a lot more acceptance of this behavior. He spun in circles to the point where I remember getting dizzy looking at him, and it didn't matter where we were. He was just always spinning. If I had any toys or objects missing, I remember going to my sibling because he always had my things organized as part of his line. It became almost like a joke because he took random things from random places, making a mess in some ways to then put them in a very organized line. And this is something that a lot of people, as they kind of were talking about the early symptoms, the line and like kind of this desire to organize things, to do these more repetitive behaviors, that was a pretty common theme. Sensory needs. We had to have this huge swing installed in our home. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just thought that was how it was for everyone. And this is something that we saw kind of across the board, and we'll see it in other themes as well. But it was really a lot of these siblings mentioned that at home and before they really had access to other peers and school, they thought everything that was happening in their home was typical. It was what everybody else was going through. And it was only when they then went to school and visited other people's homes that they realized how different their home was. I remember my parents asking me to always go outside with her before they did chores like vacuuming and cleaning up. So things where sibling is helping to avoid certain sensory triggers, making it a little bit easier for the autistic sibling. My sibling would always lay down and stack random objects on top of herself, or she would grab my hands and put them on her back. And I knew she wanted me to press down and hold it for a little. Then she would get up and walk around like nothing happened. And things like this really triggered conversations about, I wish I was just told that sensory input is also something that's common in autism. So kind of this desire for sensory input, also this aversion to sensory input or this heightened sensitivity. So really recognizing that there's multiple ways that sensory needs come into play. He would always cover his ears anytime there was a loud noise. So then we started avoiding doing things because it was too loud, and that was hard for me. I missed out on a lot. Lots of sentiments about how they don't regret anything that happened because it ultimately helped their autistic sibling, but recognizing that they missed out on a lot of things to really accommodate their sibling's needs and to really help their autistic sibling be in the most comfortable state. But that resulted in them missing out on opportunities that they might have had in a different situation. Emotion dysregulation and self-injurious behaviors. He would just hit himself or bang his head against the wall. And I remember being so concerned. That was very different. Kind of reflecting on how she saw other families and how other kids responded when they were overwhelmed or overstimulated, and how her brother looked very different. He screamed a lot. I remember being at the mall with my mom, getting a penny to throw in the fountain, the first time I ever saw a fountain, and she told me to make a wish. And I remember I wished that my sibling would stop screaming. This was something that I think a lot of the participants really nodded and jumped on board with and empathized with, because that constant screaming, the noise, everybody's kind of sensitive to noise. And of course that's on a spectrum as well, but recognizing that the screaming is also really, really tough for the sibling. And that when siblings recognize that they're not alone in that was a really powerful moment. Every little thing made him upset. And once he was upset, we all knew that the activity was over. His mood decided all activities for us. And related to what we've talked about before, just recognizing that oftentimes the autistic siblings' behavior or needs kind of were more important in the moment in deciding what to do than other people's kind of interest in sticking around. And that was accepted and everybody understood it, but still understandably felt upset that they missed out on things. And finally, communication difficulties. It seemed so sudden, but I remember he went from saying a few words to nothing at all. I thought he was being silly, so I remember I would try to make it a game and talk for him, but those words just never came back. So talking about language regressions, a few people commented on this, and we're really surprised because this wasn't, a lot of these or all of these are adults, and so language regression wasn't necessarily something that everybody knew about when these adults were in their childhood, and something that didn't necessarily fit within the autism umbrella that maybe they had done research on to really know how to support their autistic sibling. I do remember playing with her, but I think that once I started preschool, and then it was like the stark contrast of coming home, and it was like the curtain was lifted. My sister is not like the other kids at school. And this was really in the context of play, with her going to school and having these really nice imaginative play interactions and having the other kids really respond to what she was saying and doing and asking her questions and including her and keeping the story going. And then that really stark contrast, like she mentioned, when she came home and her sister wasn't interacting with her in the way that her peers were. And then I don't know if I would just reach a breaking point and it was like, okay, I'm done trying to talk to you. I want to go in my room and hide, like I can't. It's just too hard when it feels like you're playing alone and talking to yourself. And there was a lot of frustration, but always prefaced with, I wouldn't change a thing, and I never blame my autistic sibling for anything that happened. I know they were just trying their best, but recognizing that it's okay to feel annoyed and hurt and frustrated in those moments when you really want a connection and it's more difficult than it is to make connections with other people. Now, key takeaways related to family planning decisions. So something that really surprised us was that many siblings were unaware or didn't know the degree to which familial recurrence risk or the higher likelihood of autism extends to that next generation. So that would be to the children of the siblings. And this was a group of siblings who were highly involved in their autistic siblings' lives, highly educated. A lot of them were actually in helping fields. And what's kind of interesting about this is it's a really surprising stat, but it represents a tangible and pretty feasible target for professionals in the field to better support siblings in providing this education. And this was also something, as we continued to, as I mentioned, we had spouses and partners involved in this. This is something that those spouses and partners were really unaware of and were really eager to learn and kind of wish they had known these things if they kind of could do it all over again. When asked about how genetics and the probability of autism recurrence factored into decisions to have families of their own, have children of their own, the siblings pretty interestingly made this differentiation between having their first child and their second. So when siblings were talking about wanting to have children of their own, specifically related to that first child, they mentioned that they were going to have that child regardless of the increased likelihood of ASD. And this, I think, was in part, and mentioned by a few of them, due to our current genetic understanding, where we can't give a specific probability based on a specific situation in particular. The percentages span a range. And a lot of these participants were saying that range wouldn't be enough to make me change my decision when I really want that child. Also, a lot of them mentioned that they had grown up with an autistic sibling and they know that they would be able to handle whatever comes their way, whatever support needs their child would have if they do have autism. But when we started talking about that second child, that's where we saw some differences. So many siblings started mentioning that they would be more interested in genetics with the second child because the decision to have a second child now doesn't only affect them as parents, but it now also affects that first child as a potential sibling. And kind of knowing the difficulties that they experience themselves as siblings of an autistic individual, they were more conscious of kind of the potential struggles and open to that genetic information for that second child, with that idea that it no longer just affects me and I have to think about others. Next, we'll talk about participation in future research. We were very excited to see that all siblings who participated in the study expressed a willingness to participate in future phases of the project, if there are future phases, and also just sibling research in general. And the sentiment that was mostly expressed was just, there's not enough of this. And if there's anything that we can do to help either themselves or other siblings like them, they were willing to do it. They wish that they had that when they were growing up. And so hopefully we can make for a better next generation of potential siblings of autistic individuals. And what's great is they were open to genetic studies, behavioral, cognitive, and studies looking at other areas of development. So pretty widespread interest in research. We also had a lot of feedback on research topics of interest and how we as researchers can help. So the first takeaway in this kind of category, many siblings expressed an interest in better understanding trajectories of development. So kind of the path to growing in that specific domain or that area of functioning, and also outcomes in autism, specifically in adulthood. We know that there is really a lack of information on what happens in autism in adulthood. And this is in part due to a lack of longitudinal research. We don't know what happens to the same child as they continue to age, especially as they get into later adulthood. We heard questions like, is my autistic sibling's aggression going to continue? Is it going to worsen? Is it going to improve over time? And this relates particularly to these siblings who maybe are thinking about taking on their autistic sibling as kind of a caregiver. And if there's aggression and that's going to continue, and we know that maybe it's going to worsen or it's going to continue, that could affect if that sibling is able to take the autistic individual into their home. Maybe that sibling has young children of their own, and an autistic sibling with aggression would be really difficult to manage when you have young children at home, potentially. Also, questions emerged like, is my autistic sibling going to be able to do things independently in adulthood? What are their adaptive skills going to look like? Are they going to be able to dress in adulthood, eat, cook for themselves, use the bus? Things like that would really help with independence. And all of these unknowns are really valid questions, and they're things that I think we all want to know. And that's why the focus on longitudinal research is so important, to really get some answers to those unknowns for what the siblings maybe should expect from their autistic siblings later in life. Some siblings also requested information about how they can best support their autistic sibling. And this was in the context of preparing for the transition from living with parents to then living with them as siblings. And they were curious about, how do we explain what's happening to the autistic sibling? And how do we maybe explain this in different ways, depending on the level of support needs of the autistic individual? How do we make this transition as smooth as possible? At what age should we make this transition happen? Should the parents still be alive when we are helping to make that transition so it's smoother? Should we keep parents involved and keep that frequent access to parents? How do we navigate this? What should this process look like? And really, it was just a call for help, because there's no guide for how to navigate this, and it's a really stressful time for these siblings. Siblings also wanted information related to taking on the caregiving role for their siblings. And something that was really interesting, and again, I think is nice to see in terms of we can do something about it. Siblings wanted to solidify their plans and the legal paperwork and all the governmental processes that relate to taking over care for their autistic sibling. And they kind of mentioned that they really want to have that figured out before many of them are able to think about bringing their own children into this world. So wanting to really make sure that their sibling was set and that they had all their ducks in a row ready for potentially taking on that caregiving role before they then brought additional children into the world. And themes that emerged within this, they wanted information about transferring guardianship, navigating Social Security, accessing funds and trusts and wills, and also securing housing options for different support needs. So think different housing options and how to fund those different housing options. What would be best to really allow the autistic sibling to thrive and be happy, but also hopefully be close by so that that frequent contact can still happen. How do we really set that up, and who's going to pay for it? And just what placement would be best for them. And here's a brief clip about how one participant described this need for caregiving information.
Dependent on my mom, and would likely be dependent on someone else as well as she gets older. My mom actually had me when she was 41, so she's older. She's an older parent in general, so I foresee having to take on that role a little bit earlier in my life, and that worries me a ton. I have no idea. It is, assisted kind of living appropriate? Is living with me full time when I want to raise a family appropriate? Is a full residential? Where do you find them? All of these kind of things. Very worrisome. And I know will be difficult to navigate. I'm kind of like trying to push it away in my head, but it will happen.
Okay. And in terms of kind of how these conversations happen, I think the main takeaway that you'll see from these quotes are really just the conversations differ between families. And also the awareness and expectations are different. There are some families where the conversations were really clear and the siblings were very much part of the conversation. And then others where it was kind of just this expected, you will take over. There's no need for a conversation about it. This is just what the expectation has always been. And also the opposite, where you are not expected to do anything. It's not your child. We're keeping everything very separate. So first example, the official conversation hasn't necessarily happened, but there's this underlying, we all know, but we don't talk about it. There will be references to it. It's very much like, and there's this trust. You are in charge of the trust. You know, we've talked about this before, right? And then I would confirm, yes, I'm aware of that. And that's kind of end of conversation. We also saw kind of on the opposite end, we didn't do things as a 4 unit very much. It was about them keeping me away and free in a sense. It was always just like, you know, this isn't your battle to fight. He's not your kid, but I have no idea what will happen when my parents cannot take care of him. Yikes, haven't planned for that. And throughout this conversation, there was a lot of really kind of serious comments and worries, but also a lot of just really shared fear and humor that was brought out of this kind of common shared fear, where it was nice to see other people also anxious about this stuff, and just to be connecting with other people who, even if their siblings are in a very different life stage, they have different levels of support need, just to know that other siblings are going through it is a really reassuring thing. Another individual said, I'm choosing to not have children of my own because I know I will be caring for my brother in the future. I told my parents that from an early age, and that has not changed. I initiated that conversation, but it would have been nice to know how to navigate that. It's awkward. We also looked at spousal and partner perspectives. And again, how we can help, what we can do, what we can provide for these spouses and partners who kind of take on this familial role in autism, but don't necessarily grow up with it. So the first thing that many spouses and partners mentioned is they would like information about the signs of atypical development. So kind of what are those red flags? And what they really mentioned is we didn't grow up with autistic siblings. And sure, I can look on the governmental websites and these big autism organizations and see what the red flags are. But things like stimming, that doesn't always make sense to somebody who doesn't know what stimming is and isn't explained, and that isn't explained to them. And they were mentioning things like, it would be nice to have a video of what this actually looks like in the real world. Different ways that this can manifest in individuals with different levels of support need, and really just to help them because they know that their spouse or partner is very in tune potentially after having grown up with an autistic sibling, but they're really trying to catch up and wanting to be part of this monitoring, but not necessarily knowing what to be looking for. Also, how to connect with the autistic person. So how do I connect with my spouse's or my partner's autistic sibling? A lot of them mentioned that it was pretty easy connecting with the other members of the family, but then it was really difficult to really develop a connection with the autistic person. And that made those interactions and the get-togethers more uncomfortable, maybe happen less frequently. And that is kind of the start of how do we keep bridging the family so that even when siblings are starting their own families, the relationship with the autistic sibling kind of continues. And I think a big part of that, and what a lot of the spouses and partners mentioned, is it would be great to be more included in that and kind of more seen and more supported so that we can help make that transition smooth. Also support for parents. And this was both parents of the autistic person who's aging, but also support for that spouse or partner who would also potentially become a parent and take on that parenthood role, have children of their own, or take on the caregiving duties of taking in the autistic sibling of their partner or spouse. How do we support them? We know that mental health difficulties and just stress and everything is really high among parents of autistic people and family members. And so how do we really provide that support? And also strategies for supporting their spouse or partner. And some examples of these things. If there was a little pamphlet about autism or a handout of things we can look for, I didn't grow up with autism, so how would I know? I come into this wonderful family and pretty easily connect with her other siblings, then I find myself putting so much effort into connecting with sibling, but it's been really hard. What about support for us as parents navigating this? Life doesn't prepare you for this, and if you didn't grow up with it, and especially that last piece, if you didn't grow up with it, you don't necessarily have that key insight into what it's like. And then related to supporting the spouse, I see my partner struggling, but I don't know how to help besides just being there. But this is different than the usual life stressors. And this person went on to explain that I can do exactly what I do for everyday struggles, just be there, listen, provide that reassurance, that support, but that's not always enough. And this life stressor is different. And it would be nice to have some support in knowing how to handle this because there are different things that are involved and different emotions that come up. And finally, advice for your younger self or the next generation of siblings. So other siblings going through what they have gone through as the sibling of an autistic individual and what advice they would give. 3 main themes emerged here. And the first was to be open about your needs and don't be afraid to ask for help. And going back to this idea that there's no such thing as an unaffected siblings, these siblings were really urging their younger selves and also the next generation of siblings to speak up when support is needed and recognize that it's okay to not be okay and it's okay to need help, even when it's clear that your autistic sibling is also in need of help, even when it's clear that your autistic sibling's needs might be more pressing than yours in some ways. It's valid to still need help, and it's valid to ask for that even when you know that maybe resources might be diluted, anything like that, recognizing that it's okay. And also being able to provide that support. Ask the questions and be part of the conversations, no secrecy. And this mainly pertained to the common sentiment among many siblings that they really were left in the dark during childhood about what autism was, what was really going on with their sibling. Of course, a lot of them knew something was different, but they didn't really know what was happening, didn't understand it, didn't know how they could help. And there was a lot of confusion. And with this confusion, there was a lot of kind of difficulties with the sibling relationship, some shame, resentment. Some people misinterpreted actions of their siblings. So if there's some aggression, interpreting that as a really purposeful to hurt the sibling when in all reality, it might be a form of communication. And this communication was really bred through secrecy. And because of this, an open dialogue was really encouraged by many siblings. And third, learn strategies to connect with your autistic sibling in their unique way. Be creative. And this mainly was related to those whose autistic siblings did not have spoken language, but they expressed having difficulty connecting and finding a way to form that bond with their sibling. And this was also emphasized by the spouses and partners of the siblings. But just when there's an absence of spoken language, it's difficult to form that bond and have that connection. But when we really think about it, and if there's some support provided, we know that there are other avenues to connecting with autistic individuals who don't have spoken language. And we can be creative and really foster those connections without having language. So seek those opportunities out early, be creative, We had some people talk about how they would connect over sounds. So they would make certain sounds and then their autistic sibling would respond with the sound. And this was a really nice shared enjoyment opportunity. There were other instances where they would go and watch the birds together and just enjoy each other's company. Didn't necessarily need to be communicating or interacting, but just being side by side. That was enough to really feel that connection. So being open to different opportunities to connect and recognizing that bonding and connection forming doesn't look the same for everybody. And this is the same participant and a little snippet of her advice for her younger self and that new generation of siblings.
So many things I could say for this in my own personal experience. But I think the biggest thing is ask the questions, have the open communication. I mean, for some reason, this memory always stuck with me. I don't remember, it was like I was a child, but I really wanted this like toy that Michael had. And I knew it was in a box. I knew it had been in a box for years. And when I tried to ask him for it, it was like, no, immediately. And I couldn't understand it. Like, he hasn't touched this toy in years. Why won't he give it to me? And it was like a lot of, childhood, whatever, yelling and things like that. But I think about it now and I'm like, it's probably related to the routine, the wanting things to be like how it makes a lot more sense to me now. I wish I had the words to kind of understand that a little more, or even know what kind of questions to ask to be more understanding and have that be a really positive in our dealings between me and him. Mm-hmm. So I'm big on these conversations and being aware, what does this diagnosis or beyond the diagnosis, what does it mean for you? How does it feel? How does it present? Mm-hmm. Really important. Yeah. I wish I had known that much sooner.
Great. So to wrap up, just want to give a special thanks to the incredible study participants, our research team, our funders, and my mentor, Dr. Kathy Lord, for making this presentation possible. And if we have time, I'm happy to take any questions. And I also, I know the slides will be provided to anybody. I have a few ongoing studies. If anybody is interested, we can pass along that information as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. And maybe we'll leave this slide up in case anybody wants to jot down your email address. But like Nicole said, these slides will be available, so you'll be able to reference this slide as well to get her email later if you're interested in those other research studies. We do have a few minutes for questions, and we got quite a few both over the weekend from the newsletter and live. So let's just jump right into it. So the first couple I'm going to ask are specifically about the study. So I think you might have showed this on your demographic slide, but can you just share again the age range of siblings in the study? Specifically, someone wanted to know if these were individuals that were growing up, decades ago before autism really started to be discussed and understood more broadly, or if they're more, in the past decade or so and just reaching young adulthood, perhaps.
Great question. So these were our non-autistic siblings, average age 31, with a standard deviation of around 3 years. And I think an interesting kind of caveat to where this sample, how the sample was recruited. For our UCLA site, we had a mix of both community referrals and siblings who have participated in our longitudinal study, or in Dr. Kathy Lord's longitudinal study. And this study, she's been looking at this group of autistic individuals, some of them with other developmental concerns, and they were recruited around age 2, and now they're about 35. And so these autistic siblings have been followed for all those years. And now we were kind of reaching out to the siblings of those autistic individuals. So with that said, I think even though this was, these non-autistic siblings are older, and the question askers is very spot on with our understanding of autism has greatly evolved. I think just as some of these participants were involved in this pretty intensive longitudinal study where autism was very heavily discussed and research was communicated as quickly as it could be, that I think characterization of that part of our sample is pretty important, but matched with a community sample who didn't necessarily have access to those research opportunities and maybe didn't have access to all of that knowledge of autism, early diagnoses, all of that. A great question.
Thank you. And then similar in the sense that's demographics related, did you notice, or did you and the other researchers notice cultural differences in terms of family roles and responsibilities, for instance, between white and non-white participants?
Great question. We noted some differences. It was primarily in terms of who has the ability to take on more of those caregiving roles currently. And it was less so about what they anticipate for the future. So across the board, people were pretty much all saying if they can take on their sibling as kind of as a caregiver for them, they're planning to do that. But there were some cultural differences related to how much support they're giving to their parents and to their siblings currently. So a lot of minority families and families with lower SES were providing more assistance to their parents currently in helping to support the autistic sibling.
And did you notice any difference between when it came to sibling order? So where the unaffected sibling fell in sibling order, as well as any difference from male versus female participants?
So we did not notice any birth order differences. And something that we know the research tends to suggest is when we have a sibling dynamic where one sibling has autism, one doesn't, even if the non-autistic sibling is younger, that non-autistic sibling pretty quickly takes on the role of kind of the teacher, the mentor. They take on that older sibling role without actually being older in age. And so that role reversal happens pretty early on. At least in the studies that have been published on it. And so we didn't see any birth order effects, especially as we are looking at this pretty relatively late in adulthood in 30s. So some of those differences that we might see really early on have probably washed out by now. And in terms of gender, we did find that more female siblings, non-autistic female siblings, responded to our search for participants and were much more eager to participate. And I think a lot of that relates to what the literature also shows with just sibling relationships. We know that female non-autistic siblings tend to be closer with their autistic siblings, a little more patient. We see closer relationships, more of that caregiving role. And so I think that's pretty fitting, especially with the content of our focus groups really centering on caregiving and family planning. That attracted, I think, a lot more female siblings than male siblings. But we're hoping that we recently completed a kind of our final wave of focus groups, and we had a few more male siblings in the mix. I'm hoping we can see what that looks like.
Great. And then sort of throughout, but particularly towards the end of your presentation, you shared examples of some advice participants would have given their younger self. And did anyone share anything that they wish specifics of they would have learned perhaps from the parent or caregiver when they were younger that maybe would have helped them understand their sibling's autism? And if so, do you have examples of that?
Yes. I think what immediately comes to mind is most of the siblings, if not all, mentioned either that they were grateful that they had this or they wish they had it if they didn't. Just an understanding and very honest conversation with parents about what the situation was. So there was a lot of secrecy with autism and what that diagnosis is and actually giving that label. So then when these siblings went to school and maybe they were at the same school as their autistic sibling and their sibling behaved in a way that was seen as kind of inappropriate to other people. And when the non-autistic sibling had to kind of respond to it, there was nothing that they could really latch onto that would explain what's happening. It was just, oh, that's my brother. He does that often. He's okay. We love him, something like that. So really giving that language, that label was particularly helpful and something that they wish they had. Also explaining, what does autism mean? What does that mean in terms of what is this diagnosis, but also what does that mean for our family? What does that mean for our sibling in particular? And I think finally, how these siblings can support parents. And I know there's this tension that was talked about throughout all of our focus groups with siblings recognizing that parents didn't want to burden them with caregiving roles, especially early on, but siblings also recognizing that they want to be involved, they want to be helpful, they want to help in taking some of the burden off of parents. And also it's a nice time to connect with their siblings. So really having these open conversations about what siblings are willing to do and ready to do, and have parents kind of understand that siblings might be willing and wanting to do more than they're initially anticipating. So open conversations.
Great. And then I think we have time for one more question. I think this would be a good one to end on. So what research or resources do you perhaps know of that are available for siblings, specifically geared toward dealing with mental health and related challenges of having an autistic sibling?
So there's not enough. I'll preface everything that I say with, we need so much more research on siblings, but there are some support groups that are being tested. There's some kind of preliminary trials with these different intervention groups that allow for siblings to meet other siblings of autistic people, have that shared experience, be able to seek support, both in terms of just your everyday struggles and some of those more mental health difficulties that might require professional involvement. So those interventions are being tested. And I think the biggest thing that we've heard just from, I can speak to what the participants in our focus group said, is with just knowing somebody else is going through something similar, even if the support needs of the autistic sibling are different, just being able to talk to people who also have autistic siblings is by far, or has been by far, the most powerful thing, especially for people who are dealing with some mental health difficulties, just going through and recognizing that they're not alone. And even if that other sibling can't provide any concrete resources to help, just knowing that they're not alone and knowing that somebody else, they're kind of going through these struggles with somebody else, is really powerful. So hopefully things expand and we have more access and more resources for these siblings, because it's a really underrepresented group in research. But currently there is not very much specifically for siblings.